Hi, Rachel here with the Charlotte Mason Plenary. We're so glad you found the audiobook of Volume 6, Charlotte's last volume, A Philosophy of Education. It is by far, in my opinion, the best and most transformative volume, so you're definitely in the right place. Now, we at A Charlotte Mason Plenary are offering this audio to you perfectly free because we think everybody should be reading Charlotte's words. However, we do offer an annotated edition in both print and in the audiobook version. So, the best of both worlds, in my opinion, is the audiobook, whether it has annotations or not, and the annotated editions. Because in the annotated editions, you get all of these wonderful side notes in the margins that explain what Charlotte's talking about, as well as give you definitions and stuff to all that Victorian English. So, best of both worlds, audiobook and annotated edition. Please visit us over at A Charlotte Mason Plenary at cmplenary.com, and I hope you enjoy the audiobook. Section 2A, The Knowledge of Man, History. I have already spoken of history as a vital part of education, and have cited the counsel of Montaigne that the teacher shall, by the help of histories, inform himself of the worthiest minds that were in the best ages. To us in particular, who are living in one of the great epochs of history, it is necessary to know something of what has gone before, in order to think justly of what is occurring today. The League of Nations, for example, has reminded us not only of the Congress of Vienna, but of the several treaties of perpetual peace which have marked the history of Europe. It is still true that things done without example in their issue are to be feared. Have you a precedent of this commission? Henry VIII. We applaud the bluff king's wisdom, and look uneasily for precedents for the war, and the peace and the depressing anxieties that have come in their train. We are conscious of a lack of sound judgment in ourselves to decide upon the questions that have come before us, and are aware that nothing would give us more confidence than a pretty wide acquaintance with history. The more educated among our Dominion cousins complain that their young people have no background of history, and as a consequence, "we are the people" is their master thought. They would face even the loss of Westminster Abbey without a qualm. What is it to them where great events have happened, great persons lived and moved? And alas, this indifference to history is not confined to the Dominions. Young people at home are equally indifferent, nor have their elders such stores of interest and information as should quicken children with the knowledge that always and everywhere there have been great parts to play, and almost always great men to play those parts. That any day it may come to anyone to do some service of historical moment to the country. It is not too much to say that a rational, well-considered patriotism depends on a pretty copious reading of history, and with this rational patriotism we desire our young people shall be informed rather than with the jingoism of the emotional patriot. If there is but little knowledge of history amongst us, no doubt our schools are in fault. Teachers will plead that there is no time save for a sketchy knowledge of English history given in a course of lectures of which the pupils take notes and work up reports. Most of us know how unsatisfying is such a course, however entertaining. Not even Thackeray could introduce the stuff of knowledge into his lectures on the Four Georges. Our knowledge of history should give us something more than the impressions and opinions. Our knowledge of history should give us something more than impressions and opinions. But alas, the lack of time is a real difficulty. Now, the method I am advocating has this advantage: it multiplies time. Each school period is quadrupled in time value, and we find that we get through a surprising amount of history in a thorough way, in about the same time that in most schools affords no more than a skeleton of English history only. We know that young people are enormously interested in the subject and give concentrated attention if we give them the right books. We are aware that our own discursive talk is usually a waste of time and a strain on the scholar's attention. So we of the PNEU confine ourselves to affording two things: knowledge and a keen sympathy in the interest roused by that knowledge. It is our part to see that every child knows and can tell, whether by way of oral narrative or written essay. In this way, an unusual amount of ground is covered with such certainty that no revision is required for the examination at the end of the term. A single reading is a condition insisted upon, because a naturally desultory habit of mind leads us all to put off the effort of attention as long as a second or third chance of coping with our subject is to be hoped for. It is, however, a mistake to speak of the effort of attention. Complete and entire attention is a natural function which requires no effort and causes no fatigue. The anxious labor of mind, of which we are at times aware, comes when attention wanders and has again to be brought to the point. But the concentration at which most teachers aim is an innate provision for education and is not the result of training or effort. Our concern is to afford matter of a sufficiently literary character, together with the certainty that no second or third opportunity for knowing a given lesson will be allowed. The personality of the teacher is no doubt of much value, but perhaps this value is intellectual rather than emotional. The perception of the teacher is keenly interested. That his mind and their minds are working in harmony is a wonderful incentive to young scholars. But the sympathetic teacher who believes that to attend is a strain, who makes allowances for the 100 wandering fancies that beset a child, whom he has at last to pull up with effort tiring to the teacher and pupil, hinders in his good-natured efforts to help. The child of 6 in 1B has, not stories from English history, but a definite quantity of consecutive reading, say 40 pages in a term, from a well-written, well-considered, large volume which is also well illustrated. Children cannot, of course, themselves read a book which is by no means written down to the child's level, so the teacher reads and the children tell paragraph by paragraph, passage by passage. The teacher does not talk much and is careful never to interrupt a child who is called upon to tell. The first efforts may be stumbling, but presently the children get into their stride and tell a passage at length with surprising fluency. The teacher probably allows other children to correct any faults in the telling when it is over. The teacher's only really difficult part is to keep up sympathetic interest by look and occasional word, by remarks upon a passage that has been narrated, by occasionally showing pictures, and so on. But she will bear in mind that the child of 6 has begun the serious business of his education, that it does not matter much whether he understands this word or that, but that it matters a great deal that he should learn to deal directly with books. Whatever a child or a grown-up person can tell, that we may be sure he knows, and what he cannot tell, he does not know. Possibly this practice of telling was more used in the 16th and 17th centuries than it is now. We remember how 3 gentlemen meet in Henry VIII, and one who has just come out of the Abbey from witnessing the coronation of Anne Boleyn is asked to tell the others about it, which he does with the vividness and accuracy we obtain from children. In this case, no doubt, the telling was a stage device, but would it have been adopted if such narration were not commonly practiced? Even in our own day, a good raconteur is a welcome guest, and a generation or two ago the art was studied as a part of gentlemanly equipment. The objection occurs that such a social accomplishment is unnecessary for children and is a mere exercise of memory. Now, a passage to be memorized requires much conning, much repetition, and meanwhile the learners are thinking about other matters. That is, the mind is not at work in the act of memorizing. To read a passage with full attention and to tell it afterwards has a curiously different effect. Mr. Bergson makes the happy distinction between word memory and mind memory, which, once the force of it is realized, should bring about sweeping changes in our methods of education. Trusting to mind memory, we visualize the scene, are convinced by the arguments, take pleasure in the turn of the sentences, and frame our own upon them. In fact, that particular passage or chapter has been received into us and become a part of us, just as literally as was yesterday's dinner. Nay, more so, for yesterday's dinner is of little account tomorrow. But several months, perhaps years hence, we shall be able to narrate the passage we had, so to say, consumed and grown upon with all the vividness, detail, and accuracy of the first telling. All those powers of mind which we call faculties have been brought into play in dealing with the intellectual matter thus afforded. So we may not ask questions to help the child to reason, paint fancy pictures to help him imagine, draw out moral lessons to quicken his conscience. These things take place as involuntarily as processes of digestion. Children of 7 are promoted to Form 1A, in which they remain for a couple of years. They read from the same capital book, Mrs. Marshall's Our Island Story, and about the same number of pages in a term. But while the readings in 1B are confined to the first third of the book embodying the simpler and more direct histories, those in 1A go on to the end of the volume, and children learn at any rate to love English history. "I'd a lot sooner have history than my dinner," said a sturdy boy of 7, by no means inclined to neglect his dinner. In 1A, the history is amplified and illustrated by short biographies of persons connected with the period studied, Lord Clive, Nelson, etc. And Mrs. Frere Lord's delightful Tales from Westminster Abbey and From St. Paul's help the children immensely in individualizing their heroes. It is good to hear them tell of Franklin, Nelson, Howard, Shaftesbury, and their delight in visiting the monuments is very great. One would not think that Don would greatly interest children, but the excitement of a small party in noticing the marks of the great fire still to be seen on his monument was illuminating to lookers-on. Possibly there is no sounder method of inculcating a sane and serviceable patriotism than this of making children familiar with the monuments of the great, even if they have not the opportunity to see them. Form 2, ages 9 to 12, have a more considerable historical program which they cover with ease and enjoyment. They use a more difficult book than in 1A, an interesting and well-written history of England of which they read some 50 pages or so in a term. 2A read in addition and by way of illustration the chapters dealing with the social life of the period in a volume. Treating of social life in England. We introduce children as early as possible to the contemporary history of other countries, as the study of English history alone is apt to lead to a certain insular and arrogant habit of mind. Naturally, we begin with French history, and both divisions read from the first history of France, very well written, the chapters contemporary with the English history they are reading. The readiness with which children write or tell of Richelieu, Colbert, Bayard justifies us in this early introduction of foreign history, and the lucidity and clearness with which the story is told in the book they use results on the part of the children in such a knowledge of the history of France as throws light on that of their own country, and certainly gives them the sense that history was progressing everywhere, much as it was at home during the period they are reading about. The study of ancient history, which cannot be contemporaneous, we approach through a chronologically arranged book about the British Museum, written for the scholars of the PUS by the late Mrs. W. Epps, who had the delightful gift of realizing the progress of the ages as represented in our great national storehouse. I have already instanced a child's visit to the Parthenon room and her eager identification of what she saw with what she had read, and that will serve to indicate the sort of key to ancient history afforded by this valuable book. Miss Burnett has added to the value of these studies by producing a book of centuries, in which children draw such illustrations as they come across of objects of domestic use, of art, etc., connected with the century they are reading about. This slight study of the British Museum we find very valuable. Whether the children have or have not the opportunity of visiting the museum itself, they have the hope of doing so, and besides, their minds are awakened to the treasures of local museums. In Form 3, children continue the same history of England as in Form 2, the same French history, and the same British Museum book, going on with their book of centuries. To this they add about 20 to 30 pages a term from a little book on Indian history, a subject which interests them greatly. Slight studies of the history of other parts of the British Empire are included under Geography. In Form 4, the children are promoted to Gardner's Student's History of England, clear and able, but somewhat stiffer than that they have hitherto been engaged upon, together with Mr. and Mrs. Quinnell's History of Everyday Things in England, which is used in Form 3 also. Form 4 is introduced to Outlines of European History. The British Museum for Children and the Book of Centuries are continued. It is, as teachers know, a matter of extreme difficulty to find the exactly right book for children's reading in each subject, and for some years we have been regretting the fact that Lord's very delightful Modern Europe has been out of print. The history studies of Form 5 and 6, ages 15 to 18, are more advanced and more copious and depend for illustration upon readings in the literature of the period. Green's Shorter History of the English People is the textbook in English history, amplified, for example, by Macaulay's Essays on Frederick the Great and the Austrian Succession, on Pitt and Clive. For the same period, we use an American history of Western Europe and a very admirable history of France, well translated from the original of Mr. Duret. Possibly Madame de Staël's Les Allemands or some other historical work of equal caliber may occur in their reading of French. It is not possible to continue the study of Greek and Roman history in detail, but an admirably written survey informed with enthusiasm is afforded by Professor de Berg's The Legacy of the Ancient World. The pupils make history charts for every 100 years, on the plan either adapted or invented by the late Miss Beale of Cheltenham. A square ruled into 100 spaces, 10 in each direction, with the symbol in each square showing an event which lends itself to illustration during that particular 10 years. Thus, crossed battle axes represent a war. The geographical aspects of history fall under Geography as a subject. This course of historical reading is valued exceedingly by young people as affording a knowledge of the past that bears upon and illuminates the present. The writer recollects meeting a brilliant group of Oxford undergraduates, keen and full of interest, but lamentably ignorant, who said, "We want to know something about history. What do you advise us to read? We know nothing." Perhaps no youth should go to college without some rudimentary course of English, European, and especially French history, as is afforded by the programs. Such a general survey should precede any special course, and should be required before the more academic studies designed to prepare students for research work. It will be observed that the work throughout the forms is always chronologically progressive. The young student rarely goes over old ground, but should it happen that the whole school has arrived at the end of 1920, say, and there is nothing for it but to begin again, the books studied throw new light and bring the young students into line with modern research. But any sketch of the history teaching in Forms 5 and 6 in a given period depends upon a notice of the literature set. For plays, novels, essays, lives, poems are all pressed into service, and where it is possible, the architecture, painting, etc., which the period produced. Thus, questions such as the following on a term's work both test and record the reading of the term. Describe the condition of A, the clergy, B, the army, C, the navy, D, the general public in and about 1685. Trace the rise of Prussia before Frederick the Great. What theories of government were held by Louis XIV? Give some account of his great ministers. Describe the rise of Russia and its condition at the opening of the 18th century. Suppose Evelyn, Form 6, or Pepys, Form 5, in council at the League of Nations. Write his diary for 3 days. Sketch the character and manners of Addison. How does he appear in Esmond? It is a great thing to possess a pageant of history in the background of one's thoughts. We may not be able to recall this or that circumstance, but the imagination is warmed. We know that there is a great deal to be said on both sides of every question, and are saved from crudities in opinion and rashness in action. The present becomes enriched for us with the wealth of all that has gone before. Perhaps the gravest defect in school curricula is that they fail to give a comprehensive, intelligent, and interesting introduction to history. To leave off or even to begin with the history of our own country is fatal. We cannot live sanely unless we know that other peoples are as we are, with a difference, that their history is as ours, with a difference, that they too have been represented by their poets and their artists, that they too have their literature and their national life. We have been asleep, and our awakening is rather terrible. The people whom we have not taught rise upon us in their ignorance, and the rabble, as the world were now but to begin, antiquity forgot, custom not known. They cry, "Choose we." Hamlet. Heaven help their choice, for choosing is indeed with them, and little do they know of those two ratifiers and props of every present word and action, antiquity and custom. It is never too late to mend, but we may not delay to offer such a liberal and generous diet of history to every child in the country as shall give weight to his decisions, consideration to his actions, and stability to his conduct. That stability, the lack of which has plunged us into many a stormy sea of unrest. It is to be noted that stability is the mark of the educated classes. When we reflect upon the disturbance of the national life by labor unrest, and again upon the fact that political and social power is passing into the hands of the majority, that is, of the laboring classes, we cannot but feel that there is a divine fitness, a providential adaptation in the circumstance that the infinite educability of persons of all classes should be disclosed to us as a nation at a time when an emotional and ignorant laboring class is a peculiar danger. I am not sure that the education implies in the old symbol of the latter does not make for national tranquility. It is right that equal opportunity of being first should be afforded to all. But that is no new thing. Our history is punctuated by men who have risen, and the Roman Church has largely founded herself, as has the Chinese Empire, upon this doctrine of equal opportunity. But let us remember that the men who climb are apt to be uneasy members of society. The desire for knowledge for its own sake, on the other hand, finds satisfaction in knowledge itself. The young men see visions, the hardships of daily life are ameliorated, and while an alert and informed mind leads to decency and propriety of living, it does not lead to the restless desire to subvert society for the sake of the chances offered by a general upheaval. Wordsworth is right. If rightly trained and bred, humanity is humble. We live in times critical for everybody, but eminently critical for teachers, because it rests with them to decide whether personal or general good should be aimed at, whether education shall be merely a means of getting on, or a means of general progress towards high thinking and plain living, and therefore an instrument of the greatest national good. Section 2b. The Knowledge of Man, Literature. Except in Form 1, the study of literature goes pari passu with that of history. Fairy tales, Andersen or Grimm, for example, delight Form 1b, and the little people retell these tales copiously, vividly, and with the astonishing exactness we may expect when we remember how seriously annoyed they are with the storyteller who alters a phrase or a circumstance. Aesop's fables, too, are used with great success, and are rendered after being once heard with brevity and point, and children readily appropriate the moral. Mrs. Gaddy's parables from nature again serve another purpose. They feed a child's sense of wonder, and are very good to tell. There is no attempt to reduce the work of this form or any other to a supposed child level. Form 1a, 7-9, hears and tells chapter by chapter the Pilgrim's Progress, and the children's narrations are delightful. No beautiful thought or bold figure escapes them. Andrew Lang's Tales of Troy and Greece, a big volume, is a piece de resistance going on from term to term. The great tales of the heroic age find their way to children's hearts. They conceive vividly and tell eagerly, and the difficult classical names, instead of being a stumbling block, are a delight, because, as a master of council school says, children have an instinctive power by which they are able to sense the meaning of a whole passage and even some difficult words. That the sonorous beauty of these classical names appeals to them is illustrated by a further quotation from the same master. A boy of about 7 in my school the other day asked his mother why she had not given him one of those pretty names they heard in the stories at school. He thought Ulysses a prettier name than his own, Kenneth, and that the mother of his playmate might have called him Achilles instead of Alan. There is profound need to cultivate delight in beautiful names in days when we are threatened with the fear that London itself should lose that rich halo of historic associations which glorifies its every street and alley, that it may be made like New York and should name a street X500, like a workhouse child without designation, an age when we express the glory and beauty of the highest peak of the Himalayas by naming it D2. In such an age, this, of their inherent aptitude for beautiful names, is a load of much promise in children's minds. The Kaffir who announced that his name was Telephone had an ear for sound. Kingsley's Water Babies, Alice in Wonderland, Kipling's Just So stories, scores of exquisite classics written for children, but not written down to them, are suitable at this stage. Form 2B has a considerable program of reading, that is, not the mere mechanical exercise of reading, but the reading of certain books. Therefore, it is necessary that 2 years should be spent in Form 1A, and that in the second of these 2 years the children should read a good deal of the set work for themselves. In 2B, they read their own geography, history, poetry, but perhaps Shakespeare's Twelfth Night, say, or Scott's Rob Roy, Gulliver's Travels, should be read to them and narrated by them until they are well in their 10th year. Their power to understand, visualize, and tell a play of Shakespeare from 9 years old and onwards is very surprising. They put in nothing which is not there, but they miss nothing and display a passage or a scene in a sort of curious relief. 1 or 2 books of the caliber of the Heroes of Asgard are also included in the program for the term. The transition to Form 2A is marked by more individual reading as well as by a few additional books. The children read their Shakespeare play in character. Certain council schoolboys, we are told, insist on dramatizing Scott as they read it. Bulfinch's Age of Fable admits them to the rich imaginings of peoples who did not yet know. Goldsmith's poems and Stevenson's Kidnapped, etc., may form part of a term's work, and in each and all children show the same surprising power of knowing, evinced by the one sure test they are able to tell each work they have read, not only with accuracy but with spirit and originality. How is it possible, it may be asked, to show originality in mere narration? Let us ask Scott, Shakespeare, Homer, who told what they knew, that is, narrated, but with continual scintillations from their own genius playing upon the written word. Just so, in their small degree, do children narrate. They see it all so vividly that when you read or hear their versions, the theme is illuminated for you too. Children remain in Form 2 until they are 12, and here I would remark on the evenness with which the power of children in dealing with books is developed. We spread an abundant and delicate feast in the programs, and each small guest assimilates what he can. The child of genius and imagination gets greatly more than his duller comrade, but all sit down to the same feast, and each one gets according to his needs and powers. The surprises afforded by the dull and even the backward children are encouraging and illuminating. We think we know that man is an educable being, but when we afford to children all that they want, we discover how straitened were our views, how poor and narrow the education we offered. Even in so-called deficient children we perceive, what a piece of work is man, in apprehension how like a god. In Forms 3 and 4, we introduce a history of English literature, carefully chosen to afford sympathetic interest and delight while avoiding stereotyped opinions and stale information. The portion read each term, say 50 pages, corresponds with the period covered in history studies, and the book is a great favorite with children. They have, of course, a great flair for Shakespeare, whether King Lear, Twelfth Night, Henry V, or some other play, and the Waverleys usually afford a contemporary tale. There has been discussion in elementary schools as to whether an abridged edition would not give a better chance of getting through the novel set for a term, but strong arguments were brought forward at a conference of teachers in Gloucester in favor of a complete edition. Children take pleasure in the dry parts, descriptions, and the like, rendering these quite beautifully in their narrations. Form 4 may have quite a wide course of reading. For instance, if the historical period for a term include the Commonwealth, they may read L'Allegro and Il Penseroso, Lycidas, and contemporary poets as represented in a good anthology, or, for a later period, Pope's Rape of the Lock or Gray's poems, while Form 3 read poems of Goldsmith and Burns. The object of children's literary studies is not to give them precise information as to who wrote what in the reign of whom, but to give them a sense of the spaciousness of the days, not only of great Elizabeth, but of all those times of which poets, historians, and the makers of tales have left us living pictures. In such ways the children secure not the sort of information which is of little cultural value, but wide spaces wherein imagination may take those holiday excursions deprived of which life is dreary. Judgment, too, will turn over these folios of the mind and arrive at fairly just decisions about a given strike, the question of Poland, Indian unrest. Every man is called upon to be a statesman, seeing that every man and woman, too, has a share in the government of the country. But statesmanship requires imaginative conceptions, formed upon pretty wide reading and some familiarity with historical precedents. The reading for Forms 5 and 6, ages 15 to 18, is more comprehensive and more difficult. Like that in the earlier forms, it follows the lines of the history they are reading, touching current literature in the occasional use of modern books. But young people who have been brought up on this sort of work may, we find, be trusted to keep themselves au fait with the best that is being produced in their own days. Given the proper period, Form 5 would cover in a term Pope's Essay on Man, Carlyle's Essay on Burns, Frankfurt Moore's Jessamy Bride, Goldsmith's Citizen of the World, edited, Thackeray's The Virginians, the contemporary poets from an anthology. Form 6 would read Boswell, The Battle of the Books, Macaulay's Essays on Goldsmith, Johnston, Pitt, the contemporary poets from the Oxford Book of Verse, and both forms read She Stoops to Conquer. This course of reading, it will be seen, is suggestive and will lead to much reading round and about it in later days. As for the amount covered in each form, it is probably about the amount most of us cover in the period of time included in a school term. But while we grown-up persons read and forget, because we do not take the pains to know as we read, these young students have the power of perfect recollection and just application, because they have read with attention and concentration, and have in every case reproduced what they have read in narration, or the gist of some portion of it in writing. The children's answers in their examination papers show that literature has become a living power in the minds of these young people. Section 2C. The Knowledge of Man, Morals and Economics, Citizenship. Like literature, this subject too is ancillary to history. In Form 1, children begin to gather conclusions as to the general life of the community from tales, fables, and the story of one or another great citizen. In Form 2, citizenship becomes a definite subject rather from the point of view of what may be called the inspiration of citizenship than from that of the knowledge proper to a citizen, though the latter is by no means neglected. We find Plutarch's Lives exceedingly inspiring. These are read aloud by the teacher with suitable omissions, and narrated with great spirit by the children. They learn to answer such questions as, in what way did Pericles make Athens beautiful? How did he persuade the people to help him? And we may hope that the idea is engendered of preserving and increasing the beauty of their own neighborhood, without the staleness which comes of much exhortation. Again, they will answer, how did Pericles manage the people in time of war, lest they should force him to act against his own judgment? And from such knowledge as this, we may suppose that the children begin to get a sympathetic view of the problems of statesmanship. Then, to come to our own time, they are enabled to answer, what do you know of A. City councils, B. District councils, C. Parish councils? knowledge which should make children perceive that they too are being prepared to become worthy citizens, each with his several duties. Our old friend Mrs. Beasley's Stories from the History of Rome helps us here in Form 2b instead of Plutarch, illumined by Macaulay's Lays of Ancient Rome. In giving children the knowledge of men and affairs which we class under citizenship, we have to face the problem of good and evil. Many earnest-minded teachers will sympathize with one of their numbers who said, "Why give the children the tale of Circe, in which there is such an offensive display of greediness? Why not bring them up exclusively on heroic tales, which offer them something to live up to? Time is short. Why not use it all in giving examples of good life and instruction in good manners?" And again, why should they read any part of Childe Harold, and so become familiar with a poet whose works do not make for edification? Now Plutarch is like the Bible in this, that he does not label the actions of his people as good or bad, but leaves the conscience and judgment of his readers to make that classification. What to avoid and how to avoid it is knowledge as important to the citizen whether of the city of God or of his own immediate city, as to know what is good and how to perform the same. Children recognize with incipient weariness the doctored tale as soon as it is begun to be told, but the human story with its evil and its good never flags in interest. Jacob does not pall upon us, though he was the elect of God. We recognize the justice of his own verdict on himself. Few and evil have been the days of my life. We recognize the finer integrity of the foreign kings and rulers that he is brought in contact with. Just as in the New Testament the Roman centurion is in every case a finer person than the religious Jew. Perhaps we are so made that the heroic, which is all heroic, the good, which is all virtuous, palls upon us, whereas we preach little sermons to ourselves on the text of the failings and weaknesses of those great ones with whom we become acquainted in our reading. Children, like ourselves, must see life whole if they are to profit. At the same time, they must be protected from grossness and rudeness by means of the literary medium through which they are taught. A daily newspaper is not on the level with Plutarch's Lives, nor with Andrew Lang's Tales of Troy and Greece, though possibly the same class of incidents may appear in both. The boy or girl aged from 10 to 12 who is intimate with a dozen or so of Plutarch's Lives, so intimate that they influence his thought and conduct, has learned to put his country first and to see individuals only as they serve or disserve the state. Thus he gets his first lesson in the science of proportion. Children familiar with the great idea of a state in the sense not of a government but of the people, learn readily enough about the laws, customs, and government of their country. Learn, too, with great interest something about themselves, mind and body, heart and soul, because they feel it is well to know what they have it in them to give to their country. We labor under a difficulty in choosing books which has exercised all great thinkers from Plato to Erasmus. From Erasmus to the anxious heads of schools today, I mean the coarseness and grossness which crop up in scores of books desirable otherwise for their sound learning and judgment. Milton assures us with strong asseveration that to the pure all things are pure, but we are uneasy. When pupils in the higher forms read the Areopagitica, they are safeguarded in some measure because they perceive that to see impurity is to be impure. The younger children are helped by the knowledge we offer them in ourselves, and chastely taught children learn to watch over their thoughts because of the angels. So far as we can get them, we use expurgated editions. In other cases, the book is read aloud by the teacher with necessary omissions. We are careful not to associate the process of nature, whether in the plant or animal world, with possible thoughts of impurity in the mind of a child. One point I should like to touch upon is this connection. The excessive countenance sometimes afforded to games by the heads of schools is not altogether for the sake of distinction in the games. I keep under my body, says St. Paul, and games which exhaust the physical powers have as their unspoken raison d'être the desire to keep boys and girls decent. No doubt they do so to some extent, though painful occurrences come to light in even the best schools. Now, a fact not generally recognized is that offenses of the kind which most distress parents and teachers are bred in the mind, and in an empty mind at that. That is why parents who endeavor to save their sons from the corruption of the public school by having them taught at home are apt to miss their mark. The abundant leisure afforded by home teaching offers that empty chamber swept and garnished which invites sins that can be committed in thought and in solitude. Our schools err, too, in not giving anything like enough work of the kind that from its absorbing interest compels reflection and tends to secure a mind continually and wholesomely occupied. Supply a boy with abundant mental pabulum, not in the way of desultory reading, that is, a sort of idleness which leads to mischief, but in the way of matter to be definitely known. Give him much and sound food for his imagination, speculation, aspiration, and you have a wholesome-minded youth to whom work is a joy and games not a strain but a healthy relaxation and pleasure. I make no apology for what may appear like a divergence from the subject of citizenship, because all boys and girls should know that they owe a sound mind and a sound body as their personal contribution alike to their city and their state. Ourselves, our souls, and bodies, by the writer, is much used in the P.U.S., as I know of no other attempt to present such a ground plan of human nature as should enable the young student to know where he is in his efforts to be good, as the children say. The point of view taken in this volume is that all beautiful and noble possibilities are present in everyone, but that each person is subject to assaults and hindrances in various ways of which he should be aware, in order that he may watch and pray. Hortatory teaching is apt to bore both young people and their elders, but an ordered presentation of the possibilities and powers that lie in human nature, and of the risks that attend these, can hardly fail to have an enlightening and stimulating effect. But the objects we have in view in teaching everyday morals and citizenship cannot be better illustrated than by a few papers written by children of various ages, dealing with self-management and exemplifying the virtues that help and serve city and country. "Oh dear," said a little girl coming out of a swimming bath, "I am just like Julius Caesar. I don't care to do a thing at all if I'm not best at it." So, in unlikely ways and from unlikely sources, do children gather that little code of principles which shall guide their lives. Section 2D. The Knowledge of Man, Composition. Composition in Form 1, A and B, is almost entirely oral and is so much associated with Bible history, English history, geography, natural history, that it hardly calls for a special place on the program, where, however, it does appear as tales. In few things do certain teachers labor in vain more than in the careful and methodical way in which they teach composition to young children. The drill that these undergo in forming sentences is unnecessary and stultifying, as much so perhaps as such drill would be in the acts of mastication and degluttination. Teachers err out of their exceeding goodwill and generous zeal. They feel they cannot do too much for children and attempt to do for them those things which they are richly endowed to do for themselves. Among these is the art of composition, that art of telling which culminates in a Scott or a Homer, and begins with the toddling persons of 2 and 3, who talk a great deal to each other and are surely engaged in telling, though no grown-up, not even a mother, can understand. But children of 6 can tell to amazing purpose. The grown-up who writes the tale to their telling will cover many pages before getting to the end of Hans and Gretel, or the Little Match Girl, or a Bible story. The facts are sure to be accurate, and the expressions surprisingly vigorous, striking, and unhesitating. Probably few grown-ups could tell one of Aesop's fables with the terse directness which children reproduce. Neither are the children's narrations incoherent. They go on with their book week by week, whatever comes at a given time, whether it be Mrs. Gaddy's Parables from Nature, Anderson or Grimm, or the Pilgrim's Progress, from the point where they left off, and there never is a time when their knowledge is scrappy. They answer such questions as, tell about the meeting of Ulysses and Telemachus, or about Jason and Hera. Tell how Christian and Hopeful met with giant Despair, or about the Shining Ones. Children are in Form 1A from ages 7 to 9, and their reading is wider and their composition more copious. They will tell in their examinations about the feeding of the 4,000, about the building of the tabernacle, how Doubting Castle was demolished, about the burning of old St. Paul's, how we know that the world is round, and a great deal besides. For all their work lends itself to oral composition, and the power of such composition is innate in children, and is not the result of instruction. 2 or 3 points are important. Children in 1B require a quantity of matter to be read to them, graduated, not according to their powers which are always present, but they require a little time to employ their power of fixed attention, and that other power which they possess of fluent narration. So probably young children should be allowed to narrate paragraph by paragraph, while children of 7 or 8 will tell chapter by chapter. Corrections must not be made during the act of narration, nor must any interruption be allowed. Children must not be teased or instructed about the use of stops or capital letters. These things, too, come by nature to the child who reads, and the teacher's instructions are apt to issue in the use of a pepper box for commas. We do not say that children should never read well-intentioned second-rate books, but certainly they should not read these in school hours by way of lessons. From their earliest days they should get the habit of reading literature which they should take hold of for themselves, much or little, in their own way. As the object of every writer is to explain himself in his own book, the child and the author must be trusted together, without the intervention of the middleman. What his author does not tell him he must go without knowing for the present. No explanation will really help him, and explanations of words and phrases spoil the text and should not be attempted unless children ask, "What does so-and-so mean?" when other children in the class will probably tell. Form 2, A and B, ages 9 to 12. Children in this form have a wider range of reading, a more fertile field of thought, and more delightful subjects for composition. They write their little essays themselves, and as for the accuracy of the knowledge and justice of their expression, why, still the wonder grows. They will describe their favorite scene from The Tempest or Woodstock. They write or tell stories from works set in Plutarch or Shakespeare, or tell of the events of the day. They narrate from English, French, and general history, from the Old and New Testament, from stories from the history of Rome, from Bulfinch's Age of Fable, from, for example, Goldsmith's or Wordsworth's poems, from the heroes of Asgard. In fact, composition is not an adjunct but an integral part of their education in every subject. The exercise affords very great pleasure to children. Perhaps we all like to tell what we know, and in proportion as their composition is entirely artless, it is in the same degree artistic, and any child is apt to produce a style to be envied for its vigor and grace. But let me say again, there must be no attempt to teach composition. Our failure as teachers is that we place too little dependence on the intellectual power of our scholars. And as they are modest little souls, what the teacher kindly volunteers to do for them, they feel they cannot do for themselves. But give them a fair field and no favor, and they will describe their favorite scene from the play they have read, and much besides. Forms 3 and 4. In these forms, as in 1 and 2, what is called composition is an inevitable consequence of a free yet exact use of books, and requires no special attention until the pupil is old enough to take of his own accord a critical interest in the use of words. The measured cadences of verse are as pleasing to children as to their elders. Many children write verse as readily as prose, and the conciseness and power of bringing their subject matter to a point which this form of composition requires affords valuable mental training. One thing must be borne in mind. Exercises in scansion are as necessary in English as in Latin verse. Rhythm and accent, on the other hand, take care of themselves in proportion as a child is accustomed to read poetry. In 3 and 4, as in the earlier forms, the matter of their reading during the term, topics of the day, and the passing of the seasons afford innumerable subjects for short essays or short sets of verses of a more abstract nature in 4 than in 3. The point to be considered is that the subject be one on which, to quote again Jane Austen's expression, the imagination of the children has been warmed. They should ask to be right upon subjects which have interested them keenly. Then, when the terminal examination comes, they will respond to such questions as, write 12 lines which must scan on Sir Henry Lee or Cordelia or Pericles or Livingstone. Or, to take a question from the early days of the war, discuss Lord Derby's scheme, how is it working? Or, 4, an essay on the new army in the making, showing what some of the difficulties have been and what has been achieved. Forms 5 and 6. In these forms, some definite teaching in the art of composition is advisable, but not too much, lest the young scholars be saddled with a stilted style which may encumber them for life. Perhaps the method of a university tutor is the best that can be adopted. That is, a point or two might be taken up in a given composition, and suggestions or corrections made with little talk. Having been brought up so far upon stylists, the pupils are almost certain to have formed a good style. Because they have been thrown into the society of many great minds, they will not make a servile copy of any one, but will shape an individual style out of the wealth of material they possess. And because they have matter in abundance, and of the best, they will not write mere verbiage. Here is an example of a program set for a term's work in these 2 forms. A good précis. Letters to the Times on topics of the day, subjects taken from the term's work in history and literature, or notes on a picture study. Dialogues between characters occurring in your literature and history studies. Ballads on current events. 6. Essays on events and questions of the day, a patriotic play in verse or prose. Here are questions set for another term. Write a paean rhymed or in blank verse on the Prince of Wales tour in the Dominions. An essay dated 1930 on the imagined work of the League of Nations. Form 5. Write a woeful ballad touching the condition of Ireland, or a poem on the King's garden party to the V.C.s. An essay on the present condition of England, or on President Wilson. The response of the young students to such a scheme of study is very delightful. What they write has literary and sometimes poetic value, and the fact that they can write well is the least of the gains acquired. They can read, appreciating every turn of their author's thought, and they can bring cultivated minds to bear on the problems of the hour and the guiding of the state. That is to say, their education bears at every point on the issues and interests of everyday life, and they show good progress in the art of becoming the magnanimous citizens of the future. Here are a few examples of the compositions of the several forms. F.B. Form 2A, Council School, Armistice Day. Soldiers dying, soldiers dead, bullets whizzing overhead, Tommies standing cheerily by, waiting for their time to die. Soon the lull of firing comes, and naught is heard but the roll of drums. And now the last shell crashes down, a soldier reels in pain. Too late the glad news comes to him, he never moves again. He is the unknown warrior, a man without a name. 2 years have passed, and home he comes to the hearts that loved him well. Who is this unknown warrior? No lips the tale can tell. His tomb is in the abbey where the souls of heroes dwell. A nation's sorrow and a nation's tears have gone with the nameless man. Who knows, who can tell the warrior's name? We think that no man can. So let our sorrow turn to joy on the grave of the unknown man. A.B. 13 3/4, 3. Write some lines in a blank verse that must scan on one of the following. A. Scylla and Charybdis. B. The White Lady of Avenel. C. The Prince of Wales in India. The White Lady of Avenel. The sun had set and night was drawing on. The hills stood black against the twilight sky. A faint young crescent moon shone dimly forth, casting a pale and ghostly radiance upon the group of pine trees on the hill, and silvering the river's eddying swirl. Now all was silent, not a sound disturbed the summer night, and not a breath of wind stirred in the pines. All nature slept in peace. But what was that standing up in the shade? A woman straight and slim, all clad in white, upon her long soft hair a misty crown, and ever and anon she deeply sighed, leaning against the rugged mountain rock, like to a moonbeam or a wisp of smoke. And on her shimmering moonlit robe she wore a golden girdle, in whose links was woven the fortunes of the house of Avenel. A cloud passed o'er the moon, and the slim ghost faded and disappeared into the air. A breeze sprang up among the pine trees tall, and then the river, murmuring on its way, whispered a sad lament unto the night. KL 13.5, Form 3. Write in ballad meter some lines on Armistice Day or Echo. Armistice Day, or the Unknown Warrior. Within the ancient abbey's sacred pile, which proudly guards the noblest of our dead, where kings and statesmen lie in every aisle, and honored poets, soldiers, priests are laid, behold, a stranger comes. From whence is he? Is he of noble birth, of rank or fame? Was he as great as any whom we see around, who work to make themselves a name? Surely he is a prince, nay, e'en a king, for see the waiting thousands gathered here, and hear the streets of ancient London ring to the slow tramp of men who guard his bier. And surely 'tis the king himself who comes as chiefest mourner on this solemn day, and these who walk behind him are his sons, all here to mourn this man. Who is he, say? How long the ranks of men who follow him to his last resting place, the house of God. Our bishops, soldiers, statesmen, all are here, gathered to lay him in his native sod. You ask, is he a prince? I answer no, though none could be interred with greater state. This man went forth to guard us from a foe, which threatened this our land. He did his work. He raised the flag of liberty on high, and challenging the powers of wrong and might, he gave up all he had without a sigh, and died for the good cause of God and right. Nor is a sense of humor wanting. M.O. 13, Form 3. Write in ballad meter some lines on Echo. Echo. Jupiter once went away from his wife to flirt with some nymphs in a wood, but Juno, suspecting that he was with them, came after as fast as she could. Now Echo, a nymph, knew that Juno was there, that the nymphs they would soon be found out, and so she kept Juno away from the wood, for if they had gone she did doubt. But Juno knew all, and her anger was great, and Echo this dreadful thing heard. Since you are so fond of talking, from now you only shall have the last word. Now Echo went far from the dwellings of men, and spent her sad life all alone, and often she'd weep and think of the past, and over her fate make a moan. Echo loved a Greek youth, but he could not love her, and she watched him all day from her bower, till she pined away, all but her voice, which lived still, and the youth was turned into a flower. R.C. 15, Form 3, Elementary Covent School. Write some verses on A. Dandy Dinmont, or B. Atalanta, or C. Allenby. Atlanta was a huntress who dearly loved the chase. She outran the deer in fleetness, and possessed a lovely face. Many eager suitors sought her, but they sought her all in vain, for she vowed she'd never marry, and her suitors all were slain. She had heeded well the warning from a witch well skilled in lore, who had told her if she married, happiness was hers no more. Then a youth whom Venus favored came one day to run the race, and by throwing golden apples he outran her in the chase. In their hour of joy and triumph Venus they forgot to thank, and the goddess, sore offended, lowered them to the wild beast's rank. J.T. Form 3. Phaeton was a willful youth who always got his way. He asked to drive his father's charge upon a certain day. But Phoebus, knowing well that danger lurketh in the sky, implored of him to wish again, and not that task to try. But Phaeton determined was to best this dangerous way, and leaped into the chariot to spite his father's sway. The horses started forward at a clashing headlong pace. Phaeton tried to hold them back and modify the race. With dreadful swiftness on he flew, losing his proper road. The earth and sky began to smoke in an alarming mode. At length, when all had burst in flames, Jupiter cried aloud. Phaeton, who had lost his head, was killed beneath a cloud. HEM 15, Form 4. Write 30 lines of blank verse on A. A spring morning following a winter morning walk, or B. Pegasus, or C. Allenby. A spring morning. 'Tis spring, and now the birds with merry song sing with full-throated voice to the blue sky, on which small clouds float soft as a dove's wing. Against the blue the pale green leaflet gleams. The dark green of the elder further down sets off the brilliance of the hawthorn hedge. Close to the ground the purple violet peeps from out its nests of overhanging leaves. On yonder bank the daffodil toss their heads under the shady lichened trees so tall. Close by a chestnut bursting into leaf drops down its sticky calx on the ground. An early bumblebee dives headlong into a half-opened flower of early pear. O'erhead in the tall beech trees busy rooks with great caw-caws and many angry squawks build their great clumsy nests with bits of twig and little sticks just laid upon a bough. And by the long straight path tall fir trees wave their graceful heads in the soft whispering breeze, and pressed against one ruddy trunk an owl in vain tries to avoid the light of day, but blinks his wise old eyes and shakes himself and nestles close amid the sheltering leaves. Now on the rhubarb bed we see, glad sight, large red buttons which promise fruit quite soon, and further down the lettuce shoots up pale, next to a row of parsley getting old. But see the peas, their curly tendrils green, clinging to their stout pea sticks for support. BB 15, Form 4. A spring morning. Soft on the brown woods a pale light gleams, and slowly spreading seems to change the brown wood to a land of dreams, where beneath the trees the great god Pan doth pipe, half goat, half man, to satyrs dancing in the dawning wan. And then come Phoebus, the visions fade, and down the dewy glade the rabbits scuttle o'er the rings they made. In the fields near by the cattle rise, and where the river lies a white mist rises to the welcoming skies. Where the downs arise and blue sky crowns their heads fast o'er the mounds, the mist is driven to where the ocean sounds. White wings against blue sky, gulls from the cliffs rise, watching with eyes that see from shore to where the skyline lies. Where blue sea fades in bluer skies, soft doth the tide creep o'er the golden sands with seaweed strands, which mayhap knew the dawn of other lands. RB Form 4. Write 30 lines of blank verse on Pegasus. The sky was blue and flecked with tiny clouds, like sheep they ran before the driving wind. The sun was setting like a big red rose. The clouds that flew by him like rosebuds were, and as I gazed I saw a little cloud, white as the flower that rises in the spring, come nearer, nearer, nearer as I looked, and as it came it took a different shape. It seemed to turn into a fairy steed. White as the foam that rides the roaring waves, still it flew on until it reached the earth, and galloping full lightly came to me, and then I saw it was a wondrous thing. It leapt about the grass and gently neighed. I heard its voice sound like a crystal flute. "Oh, come," he said, "with me ascend the sky, above the trees, above the hills we'll soar, until we reach the home of all the gods. There we will stay and feast awhile with them, and dance with Juno and her maidens fair, and hear dear Orpheus and the pipes of Pan, and wander, wander, wander up above." "O fairy steed, O angel steed," I said, "horse fit for Jupiter himself to ride, what is thy name, I pray thee tell me this." Then came the magic voice of him again, "If thou wilt know my name, then come with me." "Yet tell me first," I hesitating said. He told me, and when I had heard the name, I leapt upon his back and flew with him. AB 16, Form 5. Some verses in the meter of Pope's Essay on Man on the meeting of the League of Nations. From each proud kingdom and each petty state the statesmen meet together to debate upon the happy time when wars shall cease, and joy shall reign, and universal peace. No more shall day with radiance cruelly bright glare down upon the carnage of the fight. No more shall night's dark cloak be rent aside by flashing shells and searchlights stealthy glide. No more shall weary watchers wait at home with straining eyes for those that cannot come. The nations shall forget their strife and greed, the strong shall help the weak in time of need. May they succeed in every peaceful plan, if war can cease as long as man is man. E.H. 16, Form 5. Gather up in blank verse the impressions you have received from your readings of Tennyson's poems. Take up a volume of the poet's work, read on, lay it aside, and take thy pen. Endeavor in a few poor, worthless lines to give expression of thy sentiments. Surely this man loved all the joys of life, saw beauty in the smallest and the least. Put plainer things that hitherto were dim, and lit a candle in the darkest room. His thoughts now sad, now gay, may surely be the solace sweet for many a weary hour. His words, drunk deeply, seem to live and burn, clear, radiant, gleaming from the printed page. Nature to him was dear, and so has made her wiles for other men a treasure vast. Old books his master mind could comprehend are shown to us as pictures to a child. Read on, and when the volume's put away, muse on the learnings thou hast found therein. The time thus spent thou never will repent, for love of good things all should seek and find. E.P.H. 16, Form 5. A Lullaby Song. The little waves are shining on the shore, and the little breezes sobbing in the trees, but the little stars are shining in the sky's blue velvet lining, and Lady Sleep is tapping at the door. The little gulls are flying home to shore, and the little lights are flashing from the ships. But close your eyes, my sweet, and be ready then to greet dear Lady Sleep, who's tapping at the door. The wind is rising all around the shore, and the fishing boats speed home before the gale. But hark not to the rain that is lashing on the pane, for Lady Sleep has entered by the door. The storm has sunk the ships and swept the shore, but there's weeping in the town and on the quay. But sweet, you're dreaming fast, even though the dawn be past, and Lady Sleep has gone and closed the door. M.H. 17, Form 6. Write a letter in the manner of Gray on any modern topic. Mr. Gray to Mr. at Torquay. My dear, savez-vous que je vous hais, que je vous déteste? Vous êtes un peu fort. Still, I think that they are justified. Imagine leaving a friend for 2 months in this place without once taking up the pen upon his behalf. In English, did you know that I hate you, that I hate you? Here are some strong terms. Still, I think they are justified. Imagine leaving a friend for 2 months in this place without once taking up the pen upon his behalf. If this neglect be due only to your low spirits, I will for once pardon you, but only upon condition that you should come down here to visit me and at the same time strengthen your constitution. I can promise you but little diversion, but I think that the scenery will repay the journey, not to speak of myself. You will also be able to study many venerable vegetables which are not usually to be found in England. But I waste your time in my paper with these bêtises, and I know well upon what subject your mind is at present dwelling. Which of us indeed is not thinking of Ireland? I would give much to hear your views upon the subject. For my part, it seems to me that there can be but one true view, and it surprises me mightily to hear so much discussion upon the subject. Are we not truly a peculiar nation who passes bills of home rule, etc., with much discussion and debate, when neither of the two parties concerned will accept the conditions that we offer them, the one considering they give too little freedom, and the other too much? Accursed be the man who invented a bill which was and will be the cause of so much trouble in saecula saeculorum. Surely we need not have any doubt as to what line of action we should adopt. Surely it has not been the habit of England to let her subjects revolt without an attempt to quell them. Surely the government will not stand by and see its servants murdered, and the one loyal province oppressed. But alas, many things are possible with such a government. Here it is said by people who have been driven from that country by incendiaries that the government will let things take their course till everything is in such a condition that the Premier will rise in the House and say, "You see how things stand. It is no use trying to control Ireland. Let us leave it to the sane finers and live happily ever afterwards, free from such unprofitable cares." Such is the talk, but I believe it not. We have as a nation always muddled things, but we have muddled through triumphant in the end. It is so obvious that our interests and those of Ireland coincide that even to contemplate separation is to me incredible. Thus I remain your harassed friend, etc. In S. 15, Form 6. Gather up in blank verse the impressions you have received from your reading of Tennyson's poems. On reading Tennyson's poems. O prophet of an era yet to come, when men shall sing where men were wont to speak in words which even Englishmen knew not, and when I read thy songs, at once I felt the breath of nature that was lurking there. And then I knew that all thy life thou dwelt amid the changing scenes of nature's play, and knew the very language of the birds, and drank the essence of the honeysuckle. And when thou wast but young, I knew thy thoughts, thy doubts and struggles, for thou gave them me, and yet had I been thee, my thoughts would still have rested deep within my heart. But still 'twould be a relief to pour out all my woes in the sweet flow of sympathetic verse. Thy epithets produce a vivid scene of knights in armour or of maiden fair, and yet methinks the fairness of her face doth sometimes cover many a fault below. But to thy genius and thy work forever be owed a debt of thankfulness that we no longer tread the paths of Level Pope, or read those words that are not English born. KB 16, Form 5. The Clouds. Among the spirits of the nearer air there are three children of the sun and sea. The genii of the clouds, it is their care to give the ocean's bounty to the earth. Oft they retain it in a time of dearth, but they give all, however much it be. The youngest of the three is very fair. She is a maiden beautiful and sweet, of ever varying mood, changeful as air. Now plunged in merriment she takes delight in all she sees, now tears obscure her sight. A breeze-swept lake shows not a change more fleet. The fleecy clouds of April own her sway, they golden lie against the golden sun, or sport across the blue when she is gay. But when anon her girlish passions rise, she marshals them across the sunny skies, to flood the earth, then stops ere half begun. Her elder brother is of different mien, the clouds he governs are of different mold. When the earth pants for moisture he is seen, to spread his clouds across the filmy blue. When his rain falls, it steady is and true, persistent, gentle, ceaseless, yet not cold. From the grey bowl with which he caps the earth, it sweetly falls with earth-renewing force. Not April's rapid change from grief to mirth excites its fall, but calm, determined thought of middle age, of deeds from judgment wrought. He wreaks not blame, but still pursues his course. Aged yet of awesome beauty is the third, of flashing eye and sullen scornful brow. With an imperious hand she guides her herd, of wild tempestuous mood. Quick roused to ire is she, slow to forgive of vengeance dire. Before her awful glance the tree tops bow. And when enraged she stretches forth a hand, a long thin hand, to north, south, east, and west, and draws from thence clouds numerous as the sand. They crowd on the horizon and blot out the sun's fair light. Then, like a giant shout, the thunder booms at her dread spear's behest. AP Form 5. Sketch a scene between a Mr. Woodhouse of today and a neighbor of his. Scene: Mr. Woodhouse's private study. Persons present: owner of study and Miss Sims, a very modern young lady. Mr. Woodhouse: Oh, good afternoon, Miss Sims. I am charmed to see you. Dear, dear, how dark it is. One might almost think it were evening if the clock opposite did not directly oppose the fact. Miss S: Oh, I don't know. It's not so bad out. I'm awfully sorry to blow in like this, but I came to inquire after Miss Woodhouse's cold. Is she better? Mr. W: How very thoughtful of you. No, I am afraid dear Emma is very indisposed. It is so trying having an invalid in the house. It makes me quite miserable when I think of my poor daughter having to stay all alone in bed. But really, that is almost the best place in this dreadful weather. Do you really mean to say that you have been taking a walk? Miss S. Yes, why on earth shouldn't I? It's about the only way to get really warm. Mr. W. If the liberty might be allowed me, dryly, I should say that it was the one way in which to get a feverish cold, besides making oneself thoroughly miserable, and the ground is so damp underfoot. Miss S. Oh, it hasn't been raining much lately. I only got caught in a little shower. Visible start from Mr. W. Coyly. Excuse me, but is that a box of cigarettes up there on the mantelpiece? Mr. W. Cigarettes? Oh, no, I couldn't think of keeping them near the house. I never smoke. It irritates my throat, which is naturally weak. Miss S. But don't your visitors ever take the liberty of enjoying something of the sort? Besides, what about Miss Woodhouse? Mr. W. horrified. Dear Emma smoke a cigarette? Why, I never heard of such a thing. What would she say if I told her? Dear Emma smoke? No, no, certainly not. Miss S. laughing. Oh, I'm sure I'm very sorry. I didn't mean to offend. How do you think the old Johnnies in Ireland are behaving themselves? Mr. W. coldly. I beg your pardon? Miss S. sweetly. I said, how do you think matters are looking in Ireland? Mr. W. I am sorry. I think I could not have heard aright before. Matters in Ireland, yes. Oh, I think the Irish rebels are positively awful. To think of breaking into houses and turning the poor inhabitants out into the cold streets, where they probably nearly die of cold, it is too dreadful. Miss S. Oh, I suppose they are rather brutes sometimes, but in a way I almost sympathize with them. I wouldn't like to have to knuckle under to the English. Catching sight of Mr. W.'s expression of horror and pained surprise. I really think I'd better get a move on. Please don't look at me like that. I really don't mean half I say. Cheerio. Mr. W. Good afternoon, Miss Sims. It was so kind of you to come. Aside. Oh, how unfeeling of dear Emma to have a cold, if it means visitors like this every hour. Aloud. Good afternoon. Can you find your way out? I really shall catch cold if I move out of this room. E.g. 17, Form 5. Write some lines on spring in the meter of Allegra. Spring. Begone, for a short space, ye whistling winds and fogs and snowy clouds, and frosts that with fair lace each window pane and dainty pattern shrouds, offsprings of winter, yea. Begone, find out some icy Arctic land, upon that cheerless strand mongst piercing ice and chilling glaciers dwell. Such regions suit ye well. Go, cold winter, well are we rid of thee. Come, spring, thou fairest season, come, with the bees' enchanting hum and the dainty blossoms swinging on the tree while birds are singing. See how they clothe the branches gray in dress of freshest pink all day. Then when the dewy evening falls, they close their flowers till morning calls. Sweet morn, spring leads thee by the hand and bids thee shine o'er all the land. Thou sendest forth beams of purest gold to bid the daffodils unfold, while spring bends down with her fresh lips to kiss the daisy's petal tips. And as she walks o'er the green sward, a cheerful mavis, perfect bard, breaks into song. His thrilling notes are echoed from 100 throats of eager birds who love to sing to their sweet mistress, fairest spring. Then as she sits on mossy throne, a scarlet ladybird alone bids her good welcome, and above is heard the cuckooing of the dove. 2 butterflies in russet clad fly round her head with flutterings glad, while at her side a giddy fly buzzes his joy that she is nigh. O spring, my heart's desires shall be that thou wilt ever dwell with me. Section 2E. The Knowledge of Man, Languages. English is rather a logical study dealing with sentences and the positions that words occupy in them than with words and what they are in their own right. Therefore, it is better that a child should begin with a sentence and not with the parts of speech. That is, he should learn a little of what is called analysis before he learns to parse. It requires some effort of abstraction for a child to perceive that when we speak about something and say something about it. and he has learned nearly all the grammar that is necessary when he knows that when we speak, we use sentences, and that a sentence makes sense, that we can put words together so as to make utter nonsense, as Tommy immediately candlestick uproarious nevertheless, a string of words making perfect nonsense and therefore not a sentence. If we use words in such a way as to make sense, we get a sentence. John goes to school is a sentence. Every sentence has two parts. 1, the thing we speak of, and 2, what we say about it. We speak of John, we say about him that he goes to school. At this stage, the children require many exercises in finding out the first and second parts of simple sentences. When they are quite familiar with the fact that the first part of a sentence is what we speak about, they may get a name for it, subject, which will be made simpler to them if they know the word subject means that which we talk about. For instance, we may say the subject of conversation was parsley, which is another way of saying the thing we were speaking about was parsley. To sum up such a lesson, the class should learn words put together so as to make sense form a sentence. A sentence has two parts, that which we speak of and what we say about it. That which we speak of is the subject. Children will probably be slow to receive this first lesson in abstract knowledge, and we must remember that knowledge in this sort is difficult and uncongenial. Their minds deal with the concrete, and they have the singular faculty of being able to make concrete images out of the merest gossamer of a fairy tale. A 7-year-old child sings, "I cannot see fairies, I dream them. There is no fairy that can hide from me. I keep on dreaming till I find him. There you are, Primrose, I see you, Blackwing." But a child cannot dream parts of speech, and any grown-up twaddle attempting to personify such abstractions offends a small person whom, with all his love of play and nonsense, has a serious mind. Most children can be got to take in the notion of a sentence as words making sense, especially if they are allowed a few excursions into nonsense, the gibberish of strings of words which do not make sense. Again, by dint of many interesting exercises in which they never lose sight of the subject, they get hold of that idea also. One more initial idea is necessary if children are not to wander blindfold through the mazes of grammar as she is, not spoke but writ in books. They must be familiar with verbs, and perhaps the simplest way to approach this idea is to cause them to make sentences with two words, the thing they speak of and what they say about it. Mary sings, Auntie knits, Henry runs. In each of these examples, the child will see the thing we speak of and what we say about it. But these are matters familiar to all teachers, and we have nothing new in the teaching of grammar to suggest. But we probably gain in the fact that our scholars pay full attention to grammar as to all other lessons. We look forward, hopefully, to the results of efforts so to unify grammar that it will no longer perplex the student, as English, Latin, French grammar, each with its own nomenclature. Children in Form 2B have easy French lessons with pictures which they describe. But in 2A, while still engaged on the primary French course, children begin to use the method which is as full of promise in the teaching of languages as in English. That is, they are expected to narrate the sentence or paragraph which has been read to them. Young children find little difficulty in using French vocables, but at this stage the teacher should, with the children's help, translate the little passage which is to be narrated, then reread it in French and require the children to narrate it. This they do after a time surprisingly well, and the act of narrating gives them some command of French phrases as far as they go, much more so than if they learnt the little passages off by heart. They learn French songs in both divisions and act French fables by Violet Partingen in Form 2A. This method of closely attentive reading of the text followed by narration is continued in each of the forms. Thus, Form 2 is required to describe in French Picture 20. Narrate the story Aesop et les Voyageurs. Part of the term's work in Form 3 is to read and narrate Nouveaux Contes Français by Marc Seppi. Form 4 is required, amongst other things, to read and narrate Molière's Les Femmes Savantes. Forms 5 and 6 are required to write a résumé of Les Misanthropes or L'Avare. Translate into French modern verse, page 50, leisure. We have not space to follow in detail the work of the PUS in French, which of course includes the usual attention to French grammar, but it may interest the reader to see the sort of thing that students of the House of Education are able to accomplish in the way of narration. The French mistress gives, let us suppose, a lecture in history or literature, lasting, say, for half an hour. At the end, the students will narrate the substance of the lecture with few omissions and few errors. Here is an example of the sort of thing Mr. Household heard on the occasion of a short visit to the House of Education, Ambleside. A French lesson was given to the second-year students by the French mistress, a native of Tournai, who came to Ambleside in 1915. She had been teaching in England for some years, but had not previously come into contact with Miss Mason's methods. Those methods were exactly followed during the lesson. There was the book of recognized literary merit, the single reading, and the immediate narration, of course in French. The book was Alphonse Daudet's Lettres de Montmollon, and the story read was Les Chèvres de Monsieur Seguin. Before the reading began, a very few words of explanation were given, of course, in French. Then 9 pages of the stories were read straight through by the mistress, without pause or interruption of any kind, at the same pace that one would read an English story. The students followed by ear only. They had no books. As soon as the reading ended, on the instant, without hesitation of any kind, narration began in French, different members of the class taking up the story in turn till it was finished. All were good, some astonishingly good. To all, French was a tongue in which they could think and speak with considerable facility. Yet the time given to French is 2 hours and 3/4 a week only. Such results compel attention. It may be added that last year the writer heard a history lecture on the reign of Louis XI given in French by the same mistress to the then senior students, and the content of the lecture was narrated in a similar manner with the same astonishing success. This hitherto unused power of concentrated attention in the study of languages, whether ancient or modern, appears to hold the promise of making us at last a nation of linguists. We have attained very good results in Italian and German by this same method, both in the House of Education and the practicing school belonging to it, and we are in a fair way to produce noticeable results in Latin. The classical mistress writes, Latin is taught at the House of Education by means of narration after each section has been thoroughly studied in grammar, syntax, and style. The literature studied increases in difficulty as the pupil advances in grammar, etc. Nothing but good Latin is ever narrated, so the pupil acquires style as well as structure. The substance of the passage is usually reproduced with the phraseology and style of the original, and both students and children learn what is really Latin and realize that it is a language and not a mere grammar. Here we get grammar, that is, construction, learned as we learn it in English, at the lips of those who know, and the extraordinary readiness in acquiring new words shown by the scholars promises English folk the copious vocabulary in one or another foreign language, the lack of which is a national distress. Section 2F. The Knowledge of Man, Art. There are few subjects regarded with more respect and less confidence in our schools than this of art. Of course, we say children should have their artistic powers cultivated, especially those who have such powers, but how is the question. The neat solution offered by South Kensington in the 60s, freehand drawing, perspective, drawing from the round, has long been rejected, but nothing definite has taken its place, and we still see models of cones, cubes, and so on, disposed so that the eye may take them in freely, and that the hand may perhaps produce what the eye has seen. But we begin now to understand that art is not to be approached by such a macadamized road. It is of the spirit, and in ways of the spirit we must make our attempt. We recognize that the power of appreciating art and of producing to some extent an interpretation of what one sees is as universal as intelligence, imagination, nay, speech, the power of producing words. But there must be knowledge, and in the first place, not the technical knowledge of how to produce, but some reverent knowledge of what has been produced. That is, children should learn pictures line by line, group by group, by reading not books, but pictures themselves. A friendly picture dealer supplies us with half a dozen beautiful little reproductions of the work of some single artist, term by term. After a short story of the artist's life and a few sympathetic words about his trees or his skies, his river paths or his figures, the little pictures are studied one at a time. That is, children learn not merely to see a picture, but to look at it, taking in every detail. Then the picture is turned over, and the children tell what they have seen. A dog driving a flock of sheep along a road, but nobody with the dog. Ah, there is the boy lying down by the stream, drinking. It is morning, as you can see by the light, so the sheep are being driven to pasture, and so on. Nothing is left out. The discarded plow, the crooked birch, the clouds, beautiful in form and threatening rain. There is enough for half an hour's talk and memory in this little reproduction of a picture, and the children will know it whenever they see it, whether a signed proof, a copy in oils, or the original itself in one of our galleries. We hear of a small boy with his parents in the National Gallery. The boy, who had wandered off on his own account, came running back with the news. "Oh, Mummy, there's one of our constables on that wall." In this way, children become acquainted with 100 or hundreds of great artists during their school life, and it is an intimacy which never forsakes them. A group of children are going up to London for a treat. "Where would you like to go?" "Oh, Mummy, to the National Gallery to see the Rembrandts." Young people go to tea in a room strange to them and are delighted to recognize 2 or 3 reproductions of De Hooch's pictures. In the course of school life, children get an open sesame to many art galleries, and to many a cultivated home, and life itself is illustrated for them at many points. For it is true, as Browning told us, "For, don't you mark, we're made so that we love first when we see them painted, things we have passed perhaps 100 times nor cared to see." Here is an example of how beautiful and familiar things give quite new delight when they are pictured. A lady writes, "I was invited to a small village to talk about the PU school. 12 really interested women came in spite of heavy rain. I suggested introducing them to some of the friends their children had made, and we had a delightful picture talk with Jean Corot. Delightful to me because of the way one woman especially narrated. She did it as if she had been set free for the first time for months. It was the evening picture with a canal on the right and that splendid mass of quiet trees in the center. The others gave bits of the picture, but she gave the whole thing. It was a green pasture to her." The noteworthy thing is that these women were familiar with all such details as Corot offers in their own beautiful neighborhoods. But Browning is right. We learn to see things when we see them painted. It will be noticed that the work done on these pictures is done by the children themselves. There is no talk about schools of painting, little about style. Consideration of these matters comes in later life, but the first and most important thing is to know the pictures themselves. As in a worthy book, we leave the author to tell his own tale. So do we trust a picture to tell its tale through the medium the artist gave it. In the region of art, as elsewhere, we shut out the middleman. Forms 5 and 6 are asked to describe, with study in sepia, Corot's evening. Beyond this of a rough study from memory of a given picture or of any section of it, these picture studies do not afford much material for actual drawing. They are never copied, lest an attempt to copy should lessen a child's reverence for great work. We are shy in speaking of what we do in actual drawing, since Herr Cizek came among us and showed us what great things children could do with scarcely any obvious teaching and but little suggestion. But probably such work is only to be done under the inspiration of an artist of unusual powers, and I am writing for teachers who depend upon their children rather than upon themselves. They illustrate favorite scenes and passages in the books read during the term, and the spirit with which the illustrations are drawn and the fitting details introduced make the teacher aware of how much more the children have seen in the passage than he has himself. Their courage in grappling with points of technique is very instructive. They tackle a crowd with wonderful ingenuity, a crowd listening to Mark Antony's oration, cheering the Prince of Wales in India. In fact, wherever a crowd is wanted, it is suggested pretty much as an artist would give it by a show of heads. Like those Viennese children, they use all their paper, whether for a landscape or the details in a room. They give you horses leaping brooks, dogs running after cats, sheep on the road, always with a sense of motion. It is evident that children study the figures they see with due attention, and will give you a gardener sharpening his scythe, their mother sewing, a man rowing or driving or mowing. Their chairs stand on 4 legs and their figures on 2 feet in a surprising way, and they are always on the watch to correct their errors by what they see. They have a delightful and courageous sense of color, and any child will convince you that he has it in him to be an artist. Their field studies give them great scope. The first buttercup in a child's nature notebook is shockingly crude, the sort of thing to scandalize a teacher of brush drawing. But by and by another buttercup will appear, with the delicate poise, uplift, and radiance of the growing flower. Drawing is generally so well taught now that we need do no more than emphasize 1 or 2 special points in our work, such as the definite study of pictures and the illustrations of nature notebooks. We do what is possible to introduce children to architecture, and we practice clay modeling and the various artistic handicrafts, but there is nothing unusual in our work in these directions. With musical appreciation, the case is different, and we cannot do better than quote from an address made by Mrs. Howard Glover at the Ambleside Conference of the Parents' Union, 1922. Musical appreciation, which is so much before the eye at the present moment, originated in the PNEU about 25 years ago. At that time I was playing to my little child much of the best music in which I was interested, and Miss Mason happened to hear of what I was doing. She realized that music might give great joy and interest to the life of all, and she felt that just as children in the PUS were given the greatest literature and art, so they should have the greatest music as well. She asked me to write an article in the review on the results of my observations, and to make a program of music each term which might be played to the children. From that day to this, at the beginning of every term, a program has appeared. Thus began a movement which was to spread far and wide. Musical appreciation, of course, has nothing to do with playing the piano. It used to be thought that learning music must mean this, and it was supposed that children who had no talent for playing were unmusical and would not like concerts. But musical appreciation had no more to do with playing an instrument than acting had to do with an appreciation of Shakespeare, or painting with enjoyment of pictures. I think that all children should take musical appreciation, and not only the musical ones, for it has been proved that only 3% of children are what is called tone deaf, and if they are taken at an early age, it is astonishing how children who appear to be without ear develop it and are able to enjoy listening to music with understanding. I hope you enjoyed this chapter of Charlotte Mason's Volume 6. And of course, if you need help, there's always the annotated edition, or you can come find us and ask questions. We'd love to help you. You can find us at cmplenary.com or over in our Facebook group. Look forward to chatting with you.